The Vatican had not yet adjusted to the silence of Pope Leo, the first 14th in the days following his election on May 8, 200125. There was no dramatic shift in protocol, no thunderous homilies, or sweeping appointments. The crowds had come, yes, and the media had swarmed the square for his first blessing. But inside the Apostolic Palace, those closest to him quickly realized this was a man who moved differently. Quietly, thoughtfully, he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was usually to ask a question no one had expected 10 days into his papacy. He began a habit that was not part of the official schedule, walking the halls alone at night, no entourage, no protocol, no announcement. It began on May 18 sometime. After midnight, the papal apartment lights dimmed at the usual hour, and the Swiss guards assumed the Holy Father had retired. But at 12:41 a.m., two stationed outside the papal floor saw the door. Quietly open, Pope Leo emerged alone, wearing only his cassock and a rosary looped around one hand. "Only a few minutes," he said gently, no need to follow. He walked slowly down the corridor of the second logia, the long arch hall that overlooked Street Peter Square. The floor glowed with soft reflections of lamplight. Outside the square was empty, wet with light. Rain, its stones glimmering like glass. The silence was nearly total, broken only by the occasional rattle of a distant shutter or the muffled echo of water draining through ancient pipes. Pope Leo paused at the second window on the left. He always stopped there. From that spot, one could see the top of the basilica dome in perfect alignment with the obelisk, a view untouched since Bernini. He stood there breathing softly, eyes lowered, not in sadness, but in some posture that looked like waiting. He stayed like that for several minutes, still serene, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't know he was being recorded. All papal corridors had discreet surveillance. The Swiss guard rarely reviewed footage unless there was concern, but in the morning, during routine checks, one technician paused when he reached camera 7. There was the Pope, just as expected, standing motionless, framed in warm light, gazing out. But then at exactly 12:47 a.m., something impossible happened. The Pope did not move, but his shadow did on the polished marble floor, cast clearly behind him. The silhouette shifted not as a distortion or flicker, not as a trick of light. It stepped backward one full step, and then it knelt. It didn't blur or bend. It moved with full, distinct motion, as if bowing to something unseen. Then it remained there for 6 seconds, still kneeling, still separate, and then it rose, stepped forward, and resumed its position beneath him. Pope Leo never moved. The technician watched it 3 more times before calling his supervisor. Within the hour, the head of Vatican security had been summoned. The footage was checked, cross-checked, isolated. There were no lighting failures, no footage manipulation, no camera interference, just a man standing still while his shadow moved. Without him that afternoon, the security chief requested an audience with the Pope. He entered with humility, carrying printed stills from a video. Leo sat behind his desk, reading from the Acts of the Apostles. "Your Holiness," the chief said carefully, "this footage was recorded last night. We don't know how to explain it." Leo studied the images without speaking. He saw the frozen frame of himself standing at the window, and then he saw the shadow kneeling. The form was exact, his height, his shape, but not his posture. He looked up slowly. "Was this shared with anyone?" "No, Your Holiness, only myself and one technician." "Good, transfer the technician. Somewhere quiet, somewhere holy." "I beg your pardon." Leo smiled softly. "To a chapel. Maybe Liano, he's touched something he doesn't yet understand." The guard nodded. "In the footage?" "Preserve it," Leo said. "No commentary, no report, just keep it." The chief hesitated. "Do you remember anything from last night? Did you feel anything?" Leo didn't answer right away. He looked past the man toward the tall crucifix near the bookshelf. "I felt breath," he said finally. "Not mine, not wind, just breath on my right shoulder." The guard said nothing. Leo leaned forward. "I was not alone." Later that evening, when the Pope returned to his private quarters, he noticed something on the floor near his desk, a small piece of parchment, unmarked, folded. Once he picked it up and turned it over. No handwriting. He recognized no seal, just a sentence in faded ink. "Shadows bow when the light stands still." Leo stared at the words for a long time. Then he opened his breviary, slid the note between the pages, and closed it. He didn't pray aloud. He simply whispered, "Then let me stand long enough for all shadows to bow." The morning after the note appeared, Pope Leo didn't mention it to anyone, not to his personal secretary, not to the guards who brought him his tea, not even to Monsignor Spataro, the only aide he allowed to enter his study. Without knocking, he moved to his appointments with quiet precision, receiving a visiting bishop from Colombia, blessing a group of French seminarians, and delivering a short private message to a delegation from the Philippines. But all the while the phrase pulsed quietly at the Back of his thoughts shadows bow when the light stands still by late afternoon. He asked for a small favor. He requested access to the Vatican Mosaic Studio. Not an unusual visit, but not a common one either. The studio, located near the Basilica Sacri, is where artisans have for centuries maintained and restored the intricate mosaics that adorn St. Peter's. Leo had an odd request. He asked to see any recent repairs made in the corridor he had walked the night before, the hallway where the shadow had moved. The request confused the chief mosaicist. That corridor had no decorative elements, no images needing restoration, but the Pope insisted they met there in the evening. Just before the building closed, Leo walked the corridor slowly, eyes searching the marble walls, the soft lighting fixtures, the spaces between windows. He paused halfway through and pointed to a section of stone about chest high. Was anything ever mounted here? He asked. The mosaicist examined the spot, ran a hand over the smooth plaster. No, Holy Father. But the man pressed gently against the wall, and a hollow sound responded. Leo narrowed his eyes. Brimmy, the archivist responsible for internal renovations, quietly within 20 minutes, a short red-faced layman named Do Chim arrived, clutching an armful of binders. He bowed nervously and introduced himself. Leo gestured to the wall. Was anything ever removed from this space? Shimoni glanced at his records, flipped quickly through a volume marked 2009. To 2013, yes, he said slowly. There was a bronze wall fixture, a lantern, decorative. It was removed during Benedict XVI's reign for safety reasons. Was anything behind it? Only wiring, I believe. Who ordered its removal? Let me see. He hesitated, blinked. It wasn't Benedict. The record says it was moved under a maintenance directive signed by Cardinal Ratzinger. Leo looked at him carefully. Before he was Pope, yes, Holy Father, this entry is. From 2003, Ratzinger had been prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time. He had no jurisdiction over internal Vatican lighting. Does the directive say? Why? Simony shook his head. Only that it was urgent. But there's a handwritten margin note. Read it. Simony squinted. It says, too close to the hinge. Remove it before the weight is triggered. Hinge? Leo asked. That's what it says. Leo stepped back from the wall. There was no visible hinge, no door, just a seamless curve of plaster. He dismissed the staff. A moment, breathing softly, his eyes fixed on that blank section of wall. And then he whispered, show me what I'm holding closed. Nothing moved, no light flickered, no whisper came. But when he turned to leave, something stopped him, not physically, but in sensation of tension, like a string pulled tight between his shoulder blades. He looked back one more time and felt just faintly as though something on the other side of that wall was leaning against it too. That night, he returned to his private chapel. He lit a single candle, opened his breviary, and let the note fall out. He read it again. Shadows bow when the light stands still. He took up his rosary and began to pray slowly, quietly, one beat at a time. At the third mystery, the candle beside him flickered, not with wind. There was none. It flickered toward him. And then he noticed something new on the inside cover of his breviary. Beneath the spot where the folded note had rested, a faint imprint had appeared. Not ink, not charcoal, just the faintest mark in gold dust, like something pressed into the paper from beneath. He held it to the candlelight. The shape was unclear at first. A smear occurred, but when the light caught it just right, he saw it clearly, a name, one that hadn't been written by any human hand. He recognized it wasn't his, but he knew it. He whispered aloud, and in the silence that followed, the candle straightened, and the flame rose taller, as if the name had weight, and the air had bowed to it. By sunrise, the gold imprint had vanished. The Pope had checked again, and again, each time more carefully, more slowly, but the name was no longer there. The faint dust had gone. The paper now looked untouched. Even the candle wax had hardened cleanly, as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. But Pope Leo remembered what had seen. The name wasn't ancient. It wasn't in Latin. It wasn't even biblical. It was the name of a Bishop Emeritus Anelmo, dwarf man who had retired in obscurity a decade ago, known for little except a brief controversial commission on Marian apparitions in the late 1990s. He had lived most of his life quietly in Portugal, and in the last few years even more quietly. In fact, the last Vatican record of him was from 2018, a signature on a document requesting release from all public engagements. Since then, nothing, not even his death, had been officially dead. Pope Leo summoned Monsignor Spataro to his study and asked one question: where's Bishop Dart? Now the mantra blinked. I don't believe we know holiness. He was never declared deceased, but the last known address we had was a Carmelite monastery near Coimbra. Send someone discreetly. I want confirmation of his whereabouts before sunset. The order was obeyed. 6 hours later, a Vatican liaison returned from the monastery, confused and pale. Your Holiness, he's alive, but barely. They say he hasn't spoken in over a year. He lives in a small cell at the edge of the property. No visitors, no letters. They feed him by hand, Leo. Gave a single nod, make preparations. I'm going there that same evening under cover as scheduled. Pastoral retreat Pope Leo. The first 14th left the Vatican by unmarked car and traveled north quietly without escort. Only Spataro joining the road to Coimbra was narrow lined with eucalyptus trees and stone walls faded by the Atlantic wind. When they arrived at the monastery, the sky had already begun to bruise with dust. The Carmelites greeted him in stunned silence. No pope had ever stepped foot there, not even John Paul II, when he visited Fatima decades earlier. They led him wordlessly through the quiet cloister, past statues of the Blessed Virgin, and down a small stone corridor that curved slightly leftward just enough to feel disorienting. At the end of the passage stood a wooden door, unpainted, slightly warped. "This is his room," the prior whispered. "He hasn't spoken, not since the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 2023. Leo paused and raised his hand, and knocked no answer. He turned the knob. Gently inside the room was dim a narrow cot of crucifix, and a window barely wide enough to let in the last light of day. On a chair sat a man, thin, sunken-eyed, and motionless. But when Leo stepped inside, the man's eyes opened, and in a voice cracked with disuse, he said, "I told him you'd come." Leo froze. "You know why I'm here." Dwart smiled faintly. "No one else has ever seen it, have they?" Leo said nothing, but Dwart nodded. "I saw the wall." The old bishop whispered twice. "The first time I was a young priest, barely ordained, I passed on retreat. And it didn't move, but it watched. And the second time," Leo asked, "the second time was the night I resigned. I had a dream, no a vision. I walked that corridor again, but this time the wall had cracked, and from inside I heard not words, but weight like something waking up." Leo knelt beside him. "Did you tell anyone? I wrote it down once, but I burned the page." Leo studied the man's face. It was drawn, weathered by silence and years of penance, but there was no fear in his expression, only a strange kind of peace. "Do you know what's behind it?" Leo asked. Dwart's lips trembled. "I think it's not about what's behind, it's about what can pass through." He reached slowly to the table beside his chair. From a drawer he removed a folded cloth, inside a rosary, simple wooden, but the crucifix at the end was unlike any Leo had ever seen. It bore no corpus, only the outline of Christ burned into wood. As though from within, Leo touched it. It was warm. Dwart leaned close. "I never told anyone, because I thought I was mad, but now I see it wasn't madness. It was preparation. That corridor is not a passage, it's a membrane. Something is pressing through." Leo closed the cloth and stood. "I'll return soon." Dwart nodded once, and as Leo turned to leave, the old bishop whispered one final thing. "Your shadow didn't move, because you were already standing on the other side. The return to Rome was silent, not because of secrecy, but because Pope Leo XIV had no words left to spend. The final whisper from Bishop Duarte echoed in his thoughts like a tolling bell that refused to fade. You were already standing on the other side by the time they crossed back through the Vatican gates. The moon had climbed high above the dome of St. Peter's. Leo walked alone to the Apostolic Palace. Monsignor Spataro, though concerned, obeyed his silence and followed a step behind. Leo did not go to his quarters. Instead, he turned left toward the corridor, the one he had avoided for weeks, the one where the light had changed and the shadow had remained. As he stepped inside, nothing appeared unusual. The corridor was lit only by a single brass lamp affixed to the far wall. A quiet draft curled through it. Nothing more. The marble beneath his feet fell firm, and the air smelled faintly of incense in the evening vespers. But still he stopped, looked down. His shadow was gone. He turned. It was behind him, no. Beside him, no. Ahead. 3 times he turned, and 3 times it shifted. It didn't follow, it waited. He took a step, it didn't. He took another, it did. But in the opposite direction, he stopped again, and for a brief moment the corridor seemed to hum, not a sound, not exactly, but a presence. As though the corridor wasn't empty, as though it was expecting. Leo looked up at the painting on the wall, a depiction of the Apostle Thomas, placing his fingers into the wounds of Christ, except this time Thomas wasn't hanging. He was withdrawing. Leo blinked. The image returned to normal. He turned back and exited the corridor, heart pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. It was not merely a corridor. It was a veil, and something on the other side of it was observing. In the following days, Pope Leo resumed his routine. He appeared in public, met with diplomatic delegations, and issued 3 minor appointments to dioceses in Italy and Hungary, to the College of Cardinals. Nothing seemed strange, but something was changing inside him. It began with the rosary. He found himself reaching for it. Not the official one, not the ornate silver beads gifted by a previous pontiff, but the wooden one Bishop Dwart had given him, the one with the burned-out Christ. He began praying it every night. at exactly 3:17 a.m., not by intention, by compulsion. He would wake precisely at that hour, no alarm, no noise, and feel drawn to study there under candlelight. He would kneel before the crucifix and begin to pray, and every time he did the crucifix on a rosary would grow warm by the fifth. Night it burned his fingers, not with pain, with purpose. He held it tighter show. Me why you brought me here, that was a prayer he repeated over and over, not lead the church, not shepherd the faithful. But why me the answer came on the sixth night, but not in the form he expected. He woke again at 3:17, knelt again, prayed again. And as he finished the final decade, he looked up at the crucifix on the wall and saw something. He could not explain. The candle beside him flickered sharply to the left, its flame curled outward, tore the air as if something unseen had entered the room, and on the wall behind the crucifix his shadow returned. But it was not as it stood taller, narrower, the shoulders were wrong, the head slightly bowed, not in humility, but in anticipation. Leo stood. The shadow did not mimic him. He stepped left, it stepped right, not against him, around him. Suddenly the shadow twisted a ripple through the marble, as if the wall had become liquid for just a moment, and then it was gone. No flash, no sound, just gone. Leo pressed his hand against the wall where it had vanished. The marble was cold, but in the center beneath his palm a fine crack had appeared, invisible to the eye, but rough beneath his fingers, a fracture that hadn't been there before he removed his hand slowly, and written there in the dust, only one can pass, the one who chooses not. He stared at the line until the wind from the candle extinguished itself, then turned and left the room. No one saw him until morning, but the next day a secretary noticed something strange. The Pope's crucifix, the large one that hung behind his desk, had fallen, and on the floor directly below it the burned rosary, still warm, still unbroken, still waiting the fracture beneath the wall, faded by morning. When Pope Leo returned to a room with two trusted aides, the surface was untouched, smooth marble, no mark, no dust. Even the crucifix had been remounted by one of the assistants without comment. Only Leo knew it had fallen, only he felt the shadow return. He didn't speak of it, not to the aides, not to the cardinals, but that day, for the first time since his election, he canceled all public appearances and locked the door to his study. Inside, he pulled out a sealed envelope. He had never opened one of two identical letters left for every new pope. Both were handwritten by his predecessor, Pope Clement. The first 15th, the first letter, was given publicly read aloud past the historians. The second, private, meant only for the next vicar of Christ, always labeled the same, only for the one who sits alone. Leo had waited to open it. He hadn't known why until now. His hand shook slightly as he broke the seal. The letter was short, barely half a page, but every word was carved like stone. If you are reading this, then the voice has already found you. I do not mean a whisper in the dark. We've all heard those. I mean the voice that moves through silence itself, the one that does not ask questions, only waits for your answer. Leo sat down slowly. The next line was underlined. It will come when you are still. It will come when you do not move, and when it does, your shadow will move instead. He stared at the ink, at the impossible truth Clement had known, or someone had known before him. There were only a few lines left. Your name was not chosen by the cardinals. It was known before that smoke ever rose. Mine was too. So was the one who will follow. You don't try to speak to the voice you are not meant to ask, you are meant to hold. And if you hold long enough, the reason will hold you back. It was signed simply, C. Leo folded the letter, lit a candle, and burned it, not out of secrecy, out of obedience. That night he prayed in the crypt alone. He walked past the tombs of the saints, the marble resting places of popes long gone, Leo, John, Paul, Benedict. He stopped at his predecessor's tomb, Clement the 1015th. There were fresh flowers there. A simple white envelope leaned against the stone. Leo picked it up. It was unmarked inside, a p of paper, and one line: they will never understand the silence you were chosen to endure. He didn't know who left it, but he placed it back against the tomb, knelt, and whispered, I believe you spoke through him. So now speak through me, or hold my tongue forever. When he stood, something shifted. It wasn't the air, not a breeze, but the feeling that something had moved behind him. He turned. No one, only the long corridor leading back toward the basilica, only silence. But his footsteps sounded doubled, not echoing, accompanied. He turned again, nothing. He exited the crypt, slowly passed through the bronze gates, and paused at the Mary holding her broken son. And in the marble folds of her robes a shadow moved. Not his. He stood motionless. It stopped the marble. Light shimmered for just a breath, and then still back in his residence. He found something waiting. His breviary had been opened. He hadn't touched it, but the page had been turned to Psalm 39. His eyes went straight to verse 9. I was silent. I would not open my mouth for you. Are the one who has done this underneath it someone, or something had written in ink just a shade darker than the page? The silence is not the absence of God, it is where he waits. To be recognized, Leo stared at the page for A. Long time he did not pray. He simply closed the book and knelt beside it that night, just after 3:17 a.m. He woke, once more not from a dream, from stillness. He sat upright in bed and looked toward the corner of the room, where the wall met the floor's shadow, stood upright while he was sitting. He did not panic. He did not move. He watched, and for the first time the shadow moved toward him, not as a figure, as a shape collapsing into a single line. And then across the white wall it wrote a sentence, no. Pen, no hand, just a shadow, forming words like breath on a mirror. The voice is not coming. The voice was always here, then it vanished, and his own shadow returned to line again with his body. He lay back, eyes wide, and whispered to the dark, "If you're always here, why did I ever stop listening?" There was no reply, only the sound of wind brushing the outer glass. But in the morning the aides noticed something strange. A window in the papal bedroom had been open, and on the windowsill a single black feather, still warm, still trembling, as if whatever left it had just taken flight. The feather sat on his windowsill for 3 days. He didn't move it, didn't ask the Swiss guards to analyze it, didn't ask his housekeeper to dust it away. He simply left it there, a black feather, still faintly warm, even in the chill of the early May mornings. By the 4th day it was gone. No gust had blown it, no bird had claimed it, it had simply vanished. And Leo began to understand something he had only feared before. The voice, the presence, the stillness that made his shadow move was not foreign. It was ancient, not new, not coming, already here. That evening Cardinal Stogan visited him again unannounced. He was the only man who had seen Leo's hands tremble without speaking a word about it, the only man who asked nothing, and noticed everything. You called no one to the balcony for 4 days. Stogan said gently, "I had nothing to say," Leo replied. "And when will you speak?" "When I'm sure it's not me." The cardinal looked at the Pope's hand. "You haven't worn the fisherman's ring since the 2nd week of Easter." "Know why?" Leo turned away from the fire and sat at the edge of his desk. "Because it's not what binds me anymore." Stone said nothing. Leo reached into the lower drawer of his desk and pulled out a small wooden box, inside a piece of folded linen. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a strange object. It looked like a signet ring, but blackened, not with age, but with fire. The same ring that had once disappeared from his finger, the same ring that returned weeks later, now permanently darkened. He touched it, still warm, even in the box. Stogan raised his eyebrows. "It still lives." Leo didn't reply. He ran his thumb along the inside band, there engraved more deeply than ever before a new line had appeared: "The silence you protect will one day speak." Louder than the voice that cursed it, he handed the ring to Stone. "Tell me, that was made by men." The cardinal held it a moment, then shook his head slowly. "I've worn every kind of ring a bishop can wear. Nothing ever burned my hand without fire." Leo took it back, stared at it, then said, "It burns because I was meant to feel it." He placed the ring on the windowsill where the feather had rested and left it there. The next morning it was gone, but something else was in its place, a scrap of paper, torn, creased, but unmistakably folded with care. Leo opened it. There were only 8 words, handwritten in small, steady script. "He did not leave you." He stepped back. He folded the paper once, twice, 3 times, slipped it into the lining of his cassock. That evening he did something unannounced, no broadcast, no cathedral, just a request. He asked to celebrate Mass in a prison outside Rome. The request startled even his secretary, but the Pope insisted. "They're the only ones who will understand why I need to speak." He arrived in silence, no papal fanfare, no procession, just him in white entering the cement chapel of Rabibia prison with the weight of a man who had not slept for weeks. He didn't preach, he simply read the gospel. And when he lifted the host at consecration, something happened. A man in the 4th row, a lifer serving 2 decades for armed robbery, gassed. The host had glowed not with brilliance, not theatrically, but just enough to blur the air around it like heat rising off asphalt after Mass. The man approached the Pope. He trembled as he spoke. "I saw it was fire." Leo didn't argue. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder and whispered, "You weren't supposed to see me." The inmate blinked, then nodded. He understood. Leo returned to the Vatican with dust on his shoes and silence his mouth. He didn't speak for 2 more days, but on the 3rd day his shadow moved again. This time, while he prayed in the chapel, he sat completely still, knees, bent eyes, closed hands, open, but the shadow to his left lifted, stood, and walked across the wall. It stopped beside the crucifix and pointed not at Christ, at the inscription above him. Henry. Leo rose, slowly moved toward it, and as he approached, the light shifted, not from candles, from something behind the shadow, a deeper shape. It wasn't a person. It was more like the impression of someone who had stood there long ago, a memory cast into the air. He reached toward it, and for a split second, just before the light faded, He felt warmth wrap his fingers, not burn whole when the candles flickered back the shadow was gone, but on the marble floor at the foot of the crucifix was a ring. Black, still warm, he knelt, took it in both hands, and said aloud, not as a priest, not as a pope, but as a man, if you're still here, then I won't move. That night the windows of the Apostolic Palace remained open long past midnight, and the guards outside reported no wind, only the faint sound of wings somewhere high above the Vatican circling, not leaving waiting for 3 nights. After the ring returned, Pope Leo XIV left the windows of his private chapel open, not to invite the wind, but to make sure. Whatever had come to him, that evening knew it was. Still welcome, no wind, came no bird return, but something else happened. The crucifix in the chapel, the one above the simple marble altar nearly identical to the one he had prayed before when the shadow moved, had always been known for its solemn silence. The corpus was carved in 1835, whether from candle smoke, and set into a mahogany frame that hadn't been touched in decades. But on the first night after Leo's prayer, a small crack appeared along the top of the crossbeam hairline, thin but fresh. The sacristan noticed it the next morning and reported it quietly. The Pope only nodded. Maybe by the 3rd night, a second crack appeared, this time running down the beam behind Christ's shoulder, and by the morning of the 4th day, something had fallen onto the altar cloth, not plaster, not with a flake of paint, deep brown, almost black, shaped like a fingertip. Leo examined it himself. It smelled faintly of olive oil, and something else like ash. He asked no one to analyze it. He gave no order to restore the crucifix. He simply picked up the flake, placed it in a small linen pouch, and set it on the altar beside the chalice at noon. That day, he called for a man he had not spoken to in over a year. Father Luis Dampos, an exorcist. Unofficially, Luis had never held a formal office in the Vatican. He worked through dioceses under bishops, moving quietly through the church's margins, but Leo knew him from years ago, a mission in Ecuador, a night in a chapel that bled salt water from the walls, and a woman who had spoken fluent Hebrew despite never attending school. When Luis arrived in Rome, he was surprised. I thought you forgot me, Holy Father. Leo looked at him without smiling. I haven't forgotten anything, especially not the things I wish I could have met alone in the chapel. Leo told him everything, the ring, the shadow, the voice, the silence that followed. Luis listened, not wide-eyed, not skeptical, just still. When Leo finished, Luis only asked one question. Did it ever say your name? Leo hesitated. No. Louise nodded. Then it wasn't sent to warn you. It was sent to see if you'd stand. What does that mean? It means, Louise said gently, that you're not being tempted, you're being watched. Leo felt a cold ripple along his spine. By what? Louise said nothing at first. Then by whoever knew this would come before you. They prayed together, and during the final blessing, the crucifix above them gave a soft creak, not loud, but deep, like with surrendering the time. Leo looked up and saw it, a single bead of something dark, oily, had appeared just below the carving of Christ's right eye. It clung to the surface, then dropped and landed beside the chalice with soft pat. Louise bent to look, touched it, sniffed it, then looked at the Pope. It's not blood. What is a reminder? Louise stood. You have to go to Laredo. Leo blinked. The Holy House, yes, tonight. Why? Louise looked directly at him. Because the house moved once before, and now it's waiting again. That evening, under strict silence, Leo left the Vatican. No guards, no fanfare. He arrived in Laredo just past midnight. The basilica was closed. The rector had been discreetly informed, and the chapel was unlocked. The Holy House, the simple stone structure believed to have been a home of the Virgin Mary, miraculously transported from Nazareth, stood quiet under candlelight. Leo knelt just inside the doorway. It felt colder than he remembered. He didn't speak. He didn't even pray. He simply listened, and after 10 minutes, something stirred. Not a sound of presence. He turned, and there on the wall of the Holy House, just to the left of the narrow window, he saw it a shadow, as except he hadn't moved the shadow. Did it walk along the stone, not in rhythm with his breath, or posture it passed across the floor to the altar in the center, and stopped it, raised its hand, not to bless, but to point straight down. Leo rose, walked to where the shadow pointed there. Tucked just beneath the altar cloth was a folded cloth, not a relic, new, still faintly warm. He opened it inside the ring, but it was different, no longer black, no longer warm, clear, as if carved from crystal and engraved around the entire outer rim. You do not with a fire, you pass it forward. Leo trembled for the first time in weeks, trembled, and then he knelt, not to pray, but to wait, because something had changed. He wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore now. He was being prepared to give away. The ring of crystal stayed with him, not on his hand, not yet. Pope Leo XIV kept it in the same small linen pouch used for the flake of paint from the cracked crucifix. He placed both in the inner pocket of his cassock, close to his heart. They never left his side back in Rome. He said nothing publicly. He resumed his schedule, met with delegations, smiled. for cameras, but something had shifted in his presence, not in a way most could name, just a gravity, a quietness that seemed to follow him like his shadow, because he had seen his shadow move, and now it waited. He began to have the same dream each night. All was the same. He stood at the base of the Scala Sancta, the holy stairs believed to be from Pontius Pilate's palace, the very ones Christ ascended during his passion. But in the dream, the stairs weren't made of marble. They were ash, and each time Leo reached the seventh step, a voice said the same thing: now look behind you. And he would turn, but never see anything, only absence. On the third night, after waking in sweat and silence, Leo made a decision. He summoned Father Louise again, and this time he didn't ask for advice. He gave an instruction. I need you to prepare the chapel of St. Sylvester. It hasn't been used in years, but I want it ready by midnight. Louise didn't ask why. He bowed and left by midnight. The chapel was lit with 12 candles, one at each corner of the room, and 8 along the sides of the altar. Leo entered alone. He wore no papal vestments, just a simple black cassock and a linen pouch still pressed against his chest. He knelt, and then he did something no pope in living memory had done. He took out a pen and began to write a resignation, not dated, not finalized, but signed and folded, placed it beneath the crystal ring on the altar, and whispered, "If you gave this to me for a season, tell me when to stop." The ring did not glow, but something else happened when the candles blew out. No wind, no draft. It simply extinguished in a second, then a third, until only one remained, the one at the far right of the altar. Its flame flickered, then leaned sharply toward the center. Leo looked down and saw a single word beginning to appear on the surface of the altar, etched, not ink, like pressure from beneath the stone. One word still. He stared at it, said nothing. Then, after a long silence, still here. The flame bent again, then went out. He left the chapel without taking the ring, but the next morning it was back in a pouch, as if it had never left. Later that day, his secretary entered with a letter, a hand-delivered envelope from Kaf, Poland. It came from the Carmelite monastery. There inside, a note written by a cloistered nun. She had never met the Pope, never left cloister, and yet the letter read, "Your shadow has reached us." It asked no questions, but it stood beside the crucifix in our chapel facing east, and it pointed toward Jerusalem. Leo read it twice, then turned the envelope over. On the back was a date, March 13th, the day he had entered the chapel of St. Sylvester the nun, had seen his shadow in Poland on the same night. He folded the letter, pressed it against his lips, then said aloud, "Then I need to go." The Vatican aides protested security, insisted it was unsafe travel to Jerusalem, especially unannounced, was too difficult, too risky. He ignored them. By the end of the week, Pope Leo had quietly arranged a private pilgrimage with only 3 companions, Father Louise, his secretary, and a driver O.M., the local Latin patriarch. They arrived in Jerusalem on a clear Friday morning. No press, no vestments. They went straight to the Church of the Holy Supper, and Leo walked barefoot past the mosaics, past the altars, until he reached a place called Golgotha, the altar above the rock where the cross once stood. He knelt. No camera captured it, no journalist reported it, but the guard on duty, a Coptic Christian named Samir, swore to his bishop later that he saw something no one could explain. When Leo touched his forehead to the stone, the shadow cast behind him did not match his posture. It stood arms open, as if crucified. Samir blinked, and it was gone. Later that evening, Leo returned to his hotel. He opened his breviary and found between the pages a new slip of paper was blank, except for the same word he had seen etched into the altar still that night. He dreamed again, same step, same voice, but this time when he turned around, there was someone waiting, not a face he knew, but a presence he recognized, and it said, "If you leave now, the wall will open." Leo woke at once, lit a candle, held the ring to its flame. It did not glow, but the crystal remained clear, and he whispered, "Then I'll stay, not because I want to, but because you haven't told me to stop." He didn't sleep again that night, but when dawn came, the shadow beneath his window was no longer alone. It had merged with another identical, unmoving, and waiting word of the Pope's private visit to Jerusalem. Never made headlines. It was too carefully managed, too deliberately quiet. But silence doesn't mean secrecy. Within days, whispers reached corners of the church that few ever see, among them a monastery carved into the cliffs near Kadisha Valley in northern Lebanon. There an elderly Maronite abbot named Elis Barakat, nearly deaf, long retired from public liturgy, rang the ancient monastery bell 3 times. Without warning, it hadn't been rung in years. When the younger monks came running, they found in the library, weeping. He didn't speak. He just pointed to the old manuscript lying open on the desk. It was a Maronite text from the 17th century. Very few could read it, but Father Anthony, the youngest among them, translated. "In the time of the silent fire, the one who walks in shadow shall go to. The place of the skull, there the gate will crack, but not break. and he shall not enter, only watch Father Anthony didn't. Understand what it meant, but Abbot Elias kept repeating one phrase over and over, trembling as he said it. He didn't kneel at the tomb, he knelt at the cross back in Rome. Pope Leo the 14th was already preparing his return. The crystal ring had remained inert, cool to the touch, its clarity unchanged, but the moment his plane crossed over Italian airspace, it pulsed once not with heat, but with light, just a flicker like a lighthouse. Remembering its purpose, he held it tight in his hand, didn't speak, didn't. Sleep just preyed upon his return to the Vatican. He found a note waiting in his private quarters, plain paper folded, once no signature, no seal, just a single sentence. When your shadow touched stone, the wall sighed Leo. Didn't know what it meant, but he knew who might that evening. He requested an audience with Sister Beatrice. She was waiting in the chapel of the Archivist's place. Even most cardinals never entered. When he arrived, she didn't rise. She only said, "You walked where he died." Leo nodded, and I didn't understand any of it. Beatrice opened a leather-bound book resting on her lap. Inside, tucked between two parchment pages, was a thin sheet of vellum. Its edges were singed. She slid it forward. Leo took it was a fragment no more than 2 in wide. But the words were sharp. When he kneels in the city of the skull, and the second light does not fail, then know the wall is still closed. Beatrice said quietly, "That text is over 300 years old. It's been waiting for someone to fulfill it." Leo frowned. "So I passed some test?" Beatrice shook her head. "Number you endured it. There's a difference." He sat beside her. Then slowly, for the first time, he removed the crystal ring and set it down between them. It hasn't spoken since. Beatrice didn't touch it. She just looked at it for a long moment, then said, "Do you know what kind of crystal this is?" Leo shook his head. She smiled slightly. "Neither do I, and neither does anyone else we tested it. Once no known mineral. Not quartz, not diamond, not synthetic. It shouldn't exist." He exhaled through his nose. "That sounds about right." Beatrice reached into her robe and produced a small envelope. "This was delivered to the archive 3 days ago. No return address, but I believe you should see it." Leo opened it carefully. Inside, a single photograph, grainy. Monochrome, taken from high above. It was an aerial view of the Vatican gardens in the center, the Pope sitting on a bench taken from behind. But his shadow, it wasn't as it stood up while he sat, one hand pointed toward the Apostolic Palace, the other impossible, though it seemed to hold something, a small circular object. Leo's breath caught on the back of the photo, handwritten in pen. "It's following you now." He looked up. "Where did this come from?" Beatrice's expression darkened. "That's the second photo." "What do you mean?" She pulled a second envelope from her robe, opened and removed a nearly identical photograph, same garden, same bench, but no shadow at all, just Leo alone. She turned it over, written in the same handwriting. "This is the real one." Leo stared at both photos and asked, "How do we know which one's true?" Beatrix didn't answer. Instead, she handed him a third item, a thin slip of paper, yellowed with age, written in pencil, barely legible. "When the light casts no form, and the form casts light instead, then the wall is not a wall, it's a veil." Leo whispered, and behind it Beatrice closed the book, something that was never meant to be seen, only held back later. That night Leo sat alone in his study. The crystal ring sat on the windowsill, catching the moonlight, and on the wall beside him his shadow stood still, until for a single second it raised its hand and pointed west. The morning of May 30th. 2025 was like any other. Rome stirred slowly. Pilgrims gathered. The basilica glowed in the early sun, and inside the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo the 14th woke before his aides knocked, but something was different. The room felt still, not empty, but watched not by eyes, by memory. He rose, washed, dressed without assistance, and when he turned toward the window, he saw it again, his shadow still fixed, but as he stepped forward, it didn't follow. It remained faintly visible, even in the early light, not fully detached, but delayed like an echo trying to remember how to be a sound. He blinked, and the moment passed later. That day a sealed envelope was delivered from Sister Beatrice. No message inside, just a page, old, crisp, burned at the corners. A sentence on it was one he had seen before, but not like this. "He who casts no shadow is either too close to the light or has already entered it." Leo folded the page and slid it into his breviary. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the dome of St. Peter's, he walked into the Apostolic Chapel alone. No servers, no lights, no ring. The crystal ring, the one that had pulsed, vanished, returned, remained in its velvet case untouched for 2 days. He hadn't worn it since the photograph, not out of fear, out of reverence. But that night he brought it with him. He placed it at the foot of the altar, knelt beside it, and prayed. "If I was only meant to hold, then take it now. If you have something to say, speak. If silence is the answer, then let it ring louder than thunder." No light appeared, no flame flickered, no shadow moved. He stayed there for an hour or two, then as the midnight bell began to toll, something shifted a breeze. From nowhere no doors had opened, but the candles leaned all of them toward the altar, toward the ring. And in that flickering light the crystal began to cloud slowly, as if breath had fogged it, for within Leo watched. He didn't touch it. The ring pulsed once, then twice, then a third time, and then it cracked, not shattered, but a single fracture across its face, like lightning frozen in glass. And from the center of that fracture, a shimmer of gold, Leo reached forward, not to take it to witness. Inside the crystal, now illuminated by some unseen source, letters began to appear, not carved, not engraved, suspended, as if floating in oil. They spelled out words he did not expect. "This is not your burden. It was never yours." He whispered, "Then why give it to me?" The answer came not as text, but as silence deeper than before, and in that silence he heard something he had not in months, his own name spoken not aloud, but recognized not as a title, but as a person, just Leo. And then the ring dissolved, not burned, not melted, dissolved, as if it had never been made of matter. At all the gold inside drifted upward, vanished into the dark air, and what remained on the altar was ash, a single line of it, straight, clean, like a wound across white cloth. He reached forward, touched it. It was warm. He made the sign of the cross with it on his forehead, then rose the next morning. He did not mention what had happened, not to the secretariat, not to Sister Beatrice, not even in his private journal, but in his study beside the case that once held the ring. He left a final note and signed, unsealed. It read, "I was not chosen to lead with signs. I was chosen to stand where the signs end." That night, as Rome slept, a single page slipped loose from an old archival ledger, the one that had mentioned the name Leo. The first 14th, nearly a century before his birth, had fluttered to the floor. No windows, open no hand near the ink on the page, had changed where once it said, "He will be the wall." It now read, "He was..." And just beneath a final word in newer ink, sealed in the Vatican gardens, the next morning the Pope walked alone. The sun was strong, his robe was white, and this time when he turned the corner near the statue of St. Joseph, his shadow followed him perfectly, no delay, no hesitation, just a man in the light, and nothing left in between.